Keith Ashmore's hand froze on the doorknob when he heard the laughter. Not the nurse's professional chuckles or the maid's polite giggles. This was different. High-pitched, breathless, joyful. Children's laughter. His children. The children who had never made a sound. Keith pushed open the living room door so hard it slammed against the wall. His briefcase dropped from his hand, leather hitting marble with a crack that should have startled everyone. But no one noticed him, because the impossible was happening. Noah, Liam, and Ethan, his 2-year-old triplets who had never stood, never walked, never even tried, were moving. Actually moving on their own. Tiny legs wobbling and arms outstretched for balance, faces lit up with excitement Keith had only seen in other people's children. "Come on, baby. You can do it." The voice was warm, thick with emotion and encouragement. Lori Woolridge knelt in the center of the Persian rug, still wearing her black cleaning uniform and white apron, green gloves discarded beside her. Tears streamed down her face as she clapped her hands, guiding the boys toward her with nothing but her voice and open arms. "Mama," Liam said, his voice small but crystal clear. Keith felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Mama, Mama," Noah echoed, stumbling forward on unsteady feet. The doctors had said they would never walk. Developmental paralysis, they called it. Something about trauma, about emotional disconnection, about complications no amount of money could fix. Keith had hired specialists from Johns Hopkins, therapists from Switzerland, purchased medical equipment his own company manufactured. Nothing worked. The boys remained frozen, trapped in bodies that wouldn't respond, eyes that wouldn't focus. Until her. "What?" Keith's voice came out as a whisper, drowned by Ethan's delighted squeal as he took 3 wobbly steps and crashed into Lori's arms. Lori looked up, and her expression transformed instantly, joy melting into something like fear. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Mr. Ashmore," she breathed, scrambling to stand, pulling the triplets closer to her legs. I can explain." But before she could finish, Noah's legs gave out. Keith lunged forward in pure instinct, but Lori was faster. She caught the boy mid-fall, cradling him against her chest with practiced gentleness. "You're okay, sweet boy," she murmured into Noah's hair, voice thick with tears. "You were so brave. You walked all by yourself. Did you feel how strong your legs are?" Noah looked up at her, his tiny hand patting her cheek. Then he said it again, the word that shattered Keith's world and pieced it back together in the same breath. "Mama." Keith's knees buckled. He grabbed the arm of the sofa to keep from falling. The woman who scrubbed his floors, who he barely acknowledged when passing in hallways, who he'd probably spoken fewer than 20 words to in 6 months. She had done what an army of doctors couldn't. She had awakened his sons, and they were calling her Mama. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. The Ashmore mansion at dawn was a cathedral of wealth with no soul. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating marble floors so polished they reflected the sky. 35 rooms, each one perfectly appointed with furniture that cost more than most people's annual salary. A swimming pool shaped like a lagoon. Tennis courts, gardens that appeared in architectural magazines with captions like "Modern Luxury Redefined." But no sound, not the small chaos that should have filled a home with 3 2-year-olds. No babbling, no cries, no toys being dragged across hardwood floors. Instead, there was the hum of medical machines, the soft footsteps of nurses, the silence that came from children who had learned early that the world didn't respond to their calls. Keith Ashmore moved through the mansion like a ghost in his own home. He avoided the nursery on the 2nd floor, that wing of rooms where his triplets sat day after day, staring at nothing. He couldn't bear to look at them, couldn't stand the weight of what they represented. Emily's suffering, his failure, the choice his body had forced him to make. In another man, this might have driven him toward his children. Keith did the opposite. Instead, he worked 18-hour days in his home office on the 3rd floor, designing new hospital equipment, improving ventilator technology, perfecting surgical suites. He told himself it was necessity. The company wouldn't run itself. But the truth sat heavier in his chest. He was saving other people's lives because he couldn't save the one that mattered. Ashmor Medical had made him one of the wealthiest men in America. His equipment sat in the finest hospitals worldwide, life-saving machines, miraculous technology. Yet none of it had saved Emily. The doctors had explained it with clinical precision. Rare post-delivery complication, emergency C-section, hemorrhagic shock. By the time Keith's private jet landed in New York, she'd been comatose for 48 hours. She'd been comatose for 20 months since. And their sons, the triplets he couldn't look at, had been waiting for a mother who would never come home. Keith had hired nurses, then therapists, then specialists flown in from Johns Hopkins and Massachusetts General. At 2 years old, Noah, Liam, and Ethan should have been running, climbing, speaking in half sentences. Instead, they sat where they were placed, their eyes barely tracking movement, their bodies slack like dolls. Developmental paralysis, Dr. Martinez had said during the last consultation, his tone carefully neutral. Possibly rooted in emotional detachment, trauma during birth, absence of maternal connection, lack of consistent emotional presence. These factors can significantly impact neurological development. "What do I do?" Keith had asked, hating the hollow sound of his own voice. "They need emotional warmth and consistent presence," the doctor had replied. Keith had nodded, then written a check for another specialist and returned to his blueprints. He couldn't be what they needed. Every time he looked at the boys, he saw Emily's face the last time he'd touched her, in their hospital room before she'd surrendered to whatever depth the coma pulled her into. He saw the choice that had been made: save the children or try to save her. He saw what he'd chosen. So the nannies rotated through like seasons. 7 in the first year, each one competent but cold, affrontour, each one eventually undone by the weight of the silence. The mansion had become haunted, not by ghosts, but by the absence of what should have been there. It was past midnight when Keith sat at his desk, reviewing blueprints for an updated cardiac monitor, when he heard it. Humming, soft, soulful, drifting up through the baby monitor on his desk. It wasn't the mechanical white noise machine the current nurse used. This was human, warm, layered, carrying something Keith had forgotten existed in this house. He leaned closer to the speaker. The melody was old, something his grandmother used to sing, something he hadn't heard in decades. And beneath the humming, he heard, was he hearing it? The sound of a child moving, tiny hands patting a rhythmic pattern against something solid. Keith's hand froze on his pen. It wasn't one of his nurses. All of them worked in rigid silence, reading protocols and schedules. This was something else. Someone else. He stood abruptly, moving toward the door, not knowing whether to feel curious or afraid. In the hallway, the humming grew louder. Lori Woolridge had learned to hum to stay awake. It wasn't something the agency taught you in the 3-page handbook for night cleaners. Vacuum on Tuesdays, mop Thursdays, sanitize all medical equipment. But it was the only thing that kept her eyes open at 2 a.m. when exhaustion crept like fog through the mansion's empty hallways. So she hummed songs her grandmother had sung in the First Baptist Choir, melodies that belonged to another life, another version of Lori who'd had a future. The nursery was her favorite room to clean, though she never admitted this to anyone. It was on the second floor, painted soft green with white trim, filled with expensive furniture that felt more museum-like than livable. The crib was imported Italian wood. The toys looked untouched, positioned by someone who prioritized arrangement over play. And in the corner, in 3 identical cribs lined up like soldiers, sat 3 little boys who never moved. This was where Lori hummed. She'd started it by accident, one particularly brutal night about 3 months ago when the silence had felt like it might swallow her whole. Her fingers had been moving through a lullaby automatically, the one her grandmother used to sing while braiding Lori's hair. When she noticed, one of the boys had opened his eyes, not just opened, focused. Liam, she thought his name was, though the father rarely spoke about them. His dark eyes had tracked her across the room, something none of the specialist reports mentioned these children could do. When she'd stopped humming, his eyes had gone blank again. So she'd kept humming. Now, 3 months later, it was ritual. Every night at 2 a.m., Lori would push her cleaning cart into the nursery and begin her work while singing old spirituals, gospel hymns, the music that had sustained her grandmother through worse things than Lori could imagine. and the boys would respond in tiny, miraculous ways, fingers twitching, eyes tracking, a sound that might have been laughter. Nobody knew because Lori worked when the house slept. She understood this world well enough. The careful hierarchy of wealthy households where maids were ghosts, seen but not noticed, existing only to maintain the infrastructure of other people's lives. Lori had been invisible long enough to know how to stay that way. She hadn't always been a cleaner. 5 years ago, she'd been Lori Chen Woolridge, licensed child sensory therapist, with a master's degree in developmental neuroscience and a private practice that specialized in children with motor delays. She'd written papers on tactile sensitivity and trauma bonding. She'd given workshops on how the body remembers what the mind forgets. And she'd had a daughter named Iris who was just beginning to reach for toys. Then came the night when Iris's breathing got strange. Raspy, rhythmic, wrong. Lori had been working late, a pattern that would later feel like a choice against her own child, when the hospital called. Equipment failure, they'd said. A faulty ventilator, the kind that monitored pressure but failed to alert when sensors malfunctioned. Iris had been 4 months old. The ventilator had been manufactured by Ashmor Medical. For months after, Lori had wanted to sue, to rage, to make the world hurt the way she hurt. But rage required energy she didn't have. The lawsuit had settled quietly, a non-disclosure agreement that meant she could never speak her daughter's name in connection with the company's negligence. Her career had dissolved not from the tragedy itself, but from the shame of what followed. She defended a struggling mother accused of neglect at a rehabilitation center. And when the mother had been vindicated weeks later, Lori's outspoken compassion had made administrative people uncomfortable. They'd quietly terminated her position. So she'd become what she was now, a ghost in other people's homes, invisible and careful. But in this nursery, humming to 3 damaged boys, she felt something like purpose. Every night as she wiped down toys and sanitized surfaces, Lori whispered the same prayer, the words worn smooth from repetition. Lord, let them feel again. Let them know they're alive. Let them know they matter. Tonight, as she hummed the old lullaby, the one about safe harbors and gentle hands, Noah's tiny fist uncurled and grasped at the air, reaching for something, reaching, perhaps, for hope. The first real breakthrough came on a Tuesday night when Lori discovered that Ethan responded differently to low frequencies than his brothers. She'd been experimenting for weeks now, humming in different registers, tapping rhythms on the wooden floor, letting the vibrations travel through the toys the boys ignored. She realized quickly that they didn't respond to words at all. Words required processing, intention, the capacity to translate sound into meaning, things their frozen bodies couldn't manage. But tone, touch, vibration, these bypassed whatever circuit had been damaged and spoke directly to something deeper. One night she'd hummed a low, almost mournful note, the kind that resonated through bone and chest rather than ear alone. Ethan's entire body had stilled, then reached, tiny arms stretching toward the sound as if trying to climb inside it. This was when Lori understood. They weren't broken. They were waiting. She began staying longer than her shift allowed, moving beyond the cleaning duties that were her only legitimate excuse. After 3 a.m., when even the nurses dozed, Lori would kneel beside their cribs and simply be with them, telling stories, whispering memories she had no right to possess. Your mama, she'd whisper. Her name is Emily, and she used to sing to you before you were even born. Do you remember her voice? It sounded like honey tastes, warm and thick and sweet. She didn't know if this was true. She'd never met Emily Ashmore except in the silver frame photograph in the hallway, a woman's face frozen mid-smile, forever youthful and forever absent. But something in Lori's gut insisted these boys did remember. Not consciously, but in the cells that hold memory before words exist. Their mother had carried them, moved them, sang to them from inside her own body. They knew her. She's still loving you, Lori would murmur, placing her hands on their small chests, feeling their hearts beat beneath her palms. Even when she can't be here, she loves you. And it's okay to feel that. It's okay to let yourself move toward it. And slowly, impossibly, they did. Noah began laughing, not the mechanical sound that sometimes came from other children in therapy, but real delighted laughter that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised Lori. Liam's fingers curled around hers with purpose. Ethan's eyes tracked her across the room with focus that made Lori's heart crack open. The sounds echoed through the house in ways that shouldn't have mattered. A few giggles in the dead of night, the soft percussion of tiny hands clapping, but they traveled through the mansion's marble halls like miracles. That's when Nurse Patricia caught her. Lori was kneeling between the cribs, humming while Liam's fingers played with the edge of her sleeve when the door opened. The nurse's shadow fell across them, and Lori felt it before she saw it. That cold shift in the air that meant discovery. "What are you doing?" Patricia's voice was sharp, professional, the tone of someone who'd already begun writing the incident report in her head. Lori stood slowly, carefully extracting her sleeve from Liam's grip. "Cleaning the room, ma'am." But they both knew that was a lie. Patricia's report made it to Keith by morning. He summoned Lori to his study, a room she'd never been in, all dark wood and leather, and the kind of cold authority that made her chest tight. Keith sat behind his desk without inviting her to sit, which told her everything she needed to know about what was coming. "You've been spending unauthorized time with my sons," he said, not looking up from the file in front of him. "Yes, sir." "Against direct orders." "Yes, sir." Keith finally looked at her, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky, gray, blank, entirely disconnected. "You were hired to clean, Miss Woolridge. Not to care, not to interfere. You clean." Lori met his gaze, and something steady moved through her, the certainty of someone who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. "Sir," she said quietly, "sometimes it's the same thing." For a moment, something flickered in his expression. A crack in the ice, then it was gone. "You're fired," he said, and turned back to his papers. Lori left the study the same way she'd entered, invisibly, carrying nothing but the echo of three boys' laughter and the weight of what she'd begun and could not finish. The storm came without warning. One moment, the mansion hummed with its usual machinery, the soft whir of climate control, the beeping of medical monitors, the low electrical hum that had become the baseline of silence in the Ashmor home. The next moment, thunder split the sky open, and every light in the house died. Lori was 3 weeks gone when the power cut out. She'd spent those weeks in a fog of loss, returning to her small apartment, cleaning other people's homes for agencies that paid less and asked fewer questions. She thought about the boys every moment of every day, wondered if they'd forgotten her, if the progress they'd made had dissolved back into silence. But it was her night off, and the rain had driven her to her window, watching the storm roll across the city when she got the call. It was Nurse Patricia, or rather it wasn't. It was a woman's voice Lori didn't recognize, speaking fast, panicked. "Is this Lori Woolridge? This is emergency services. We're trying to locate next of kin for children in Mr. Keith Ashmore's home. There's been a situation." Lori didn't hear the rest. She was already moving, already calling a car, already calculating how long it would take to reach the mansion while rain hammered the streets into rivers. The power had been gone for 4 minutes when Keith realized the monitors were silent. 4 minutes of absolute darkness in a house designed around climate control and medical equipment. The generator should have kicked in. He'd paid for a backup system years ago, the kind installed in hospitals. But the generator didn't engage, and Keith stood in the hallway with his phone's flashlight casting wild shadows, trying not to panic. The triplets were upstairs, without machines, without lights, without the structured routine that had held them suspended for 2 years. Keith found himself running. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. The playroom was dark. The boys were there. He could hear them, could make out their small shapes in the thin light coming through the windows. But something was wrong with what he was hearing. They were making sounds. Not the mechanical noises of children in distress, but something like, could it be? Like playing, and there was humming. Keith's breath caught. The humming was familiar in a way that made his blood rush, made his heart seize with something between rage and hope. He stepped into the playroom, phone light cutting through the darkness, and froze. Lori was there, kneeling in the center of the floor, soaked through from rain, her cleaning uniform plastered to her skin. And around her, moving around her, were his sons. They were crawling, actually crawling, their tiny bodies propelled forward by intention, by purpose, by something that looked like joy. Toward the sound of her voice, they moved, hands reaching, faces lifted, drawn like moths to the only light in the darkness. Lori was clapping softly, creating a rhythm, and the boys were following it, following her. For one perfect moment, Keith saw it, what his sons could be, what they were becoming, what had been impossible an hour ago. Then rage flooded through him. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice cut through the humming like broken glass. Lori's head snapped up, her body instinctively positioning itself between Keith and the boys. "Mr. Ashmore, the power went out, and I was nearby, and I thought they might need—" "I fired you." "Yes, sir, I know. You don't work here. You have no right to be in this house. No right to touch them." Keith's voice shook with something he didn't have words for, something that felt like betrayal and loss and the fragile structure of his controlled grief coming apart. He couldn't bear it, couldn't bear the proof that what she gave them, what he couldn't give them, was so obvious, so necessary, so publicly shameful. "You're trespassing. Get out, now." Lori stood slowly, but she didn't move toward the door. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, with an expression that was heartbreak and pity in equal measure. "You can buy them medicine, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "You can buy them the best therapists, the best equipment money can find, but you can't buy what they're missing." She turned to the boys, knelt one last time, and kissed each of them on the forehead. Then she left. The mansion fell into a different kind of silence. The generator had kicked in finally, humming its familiar song. The monitors returned to their steady beeping. Everything was restored to order, to control, to the way things should be. And the triplets screamed. Not in distress, they'd never been loud enough to scream, but in something worse. A wailing that came from somewhere primal, somewhere that remembered what they'd had and now had lost. They cried for hours, their tiny voices hoarse, their bodies shaking with a grief that medical science had said they weren't capable of feeling. At 2 a.m., Keith's sister Marjorie called from the guest room where she'd been staying. "Keith," her voice was steady, but there was something in it, something that cut through his exhaustion like a scalpel. "They're grieving her." Keith didn't respond. He sat in the darkness outside the playroom, listening to his sons cry for someone they'd known for only 3 months, someone he'd fired on a whim, someone who'd given them back their capacity to feel. And he understood, with a clarity that shattered him, that he'd made a terrible mistake. 2 sleepless nights had turned Keith's world into something small and sharp and unbearable. The screaming had stopped by morning on the second night, which was worse than the noise itself. The triplets had cried themselves hollow, their voices surrendering to exhaustion around 4 a.m., and then fell into a sleep that looked more like unconsciousness than rest. Keith sat outside the playroom and watched them through the glass, their tiny chests rising and falling, their faces tracking something in dreams that he couldn't follow or fix or buy away. Marjorie had left after breakfast, her disapproval hanging in the air like smoke. By the second night, Keith knew he couldn't survive a third. He found Lori's address through the cleaning agency, a small apartment in a neighborhood that made him deeply uncomfortable in ways he didn't want to examine. The building was older, narrow, the kind of place where lives were lived quietly and without resources. He sat in his car for 15 minutes before climbing the stairs. When Lori opened the door, she looked shocked, then wary, then something that might have been resignation. "Mr. Ashmore," she said, not inviting him in. Keith had rehearsed this in the car, had prepared words, had constructed an apology that fit within the parameters of a man like him. None of it came. Instead, he simply said, "Come back, please." For a long moment, Lori didn't respond. Then, on one condition. "Anything." "No machines," she said quietly. "No doctors hovering. No schedules. Just trust. You let me work with them my way and you don't interfere. That's the only deal." Keith had built his empire on control, on knowing, predicting, managing every variable. What Lori was asking felt like asking him to jump into darkness. He said yes anyway. The first session happened in the playroom with sunlight streaming through the windows. Lori arrived with nothing, no equipment, no specialist reports, no protocols. She simply knelt on the carpet and removed the braces from the boy's legs, the small metal orthopedic devices that were supposed to support and protect. "These are cages," she said simply, setting them aside. "Their bodies need to remember they can move." Keith wanted to argue, to cite medical literature to protect them from the risk of injury. Instead, he stayed silent and watched. Lori began humming the same lullaby, the same melody that had haunted him through the baby monitor. She clapped softly, creating rhythm, and the boys responded to the sound like plants to sunlight. Their bodies began to move, not the jerky, uncoordinated flailing of children with developmental paralysis, but something intentional, something responding to an external guide. "Come on, sweet boys," Lori whispered. Her voice wrapped in encouragement and something deeper, a kind of faith Keith had never possessed. "You're so brave. Show your papa how strong you are." And then Noah did it. He pushed up on his hands, his tiny arms shaking with effort, and stood. Not with assistance, not with braces, but through his own determination and Lori's clapping, which guided him like a lighthouse through fog. For 3 wobbling seconds, Noah stood alone. Then his legs buckled, and he fell into Lori's arms, laughing. Something broke inside Keith's chest. Not breaking as in cracking, breaking as in shattering, as in the carefully constructed architecture of his belief in control and money and the power of machines crumbled into dust. He realized with absolute clarity that he had been wrong about everything. That afternoon, Keith drove to the hospital where Emily had been sleeping for 20 months. He hadn't visited in 3 weeks. The room was sterile, maintained by machines that breathed for her, that moved fluids through her body, that kept her heart beating in the absence of any will to do so. It was a room full of technology, exactly the kind his company manufactured. Cutting edge, expensive, designed to preserve life at any cost. Keith sat beside Emily's bed and looked at his wife for the first time without seeing failure, without seeing what he couldn't fix, without seeing a reminder of loss. He looked at her and saw a woman, his woman, the one he'd loved before everything became about survival and guilt and the machinery of their shared existence. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator hissed, mechanical and cold. The IV drips dispensed their measured doses into her arm. Metal and noise and wires, Keith thought suddenly. My entire world is metal and noise. My home is full of machines that can't feel, can't heal, can't love. He took Emily's hand, something he hadn't done in months, and was shocked at how small it felt, how warm, how human. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure exactly what he was apologizing for choosing the machines over presence, for believing money could do the work that love should do, for being afraid to look at her, to look at himself, to look at what they'd lost. He sat there for an hour doing nothing but holding her hand, and for the first time since she'd slipped away into the coma, he felt something like hope. Not that she would wake, not that everything would be fixed, but that perhaps, somewhere in the space between machines and miracles, there was still a way forward. Lori had never been to a hospital to bring someone back to life. She'd only ever been to one to say goodbye. But Keith had given her access, a visitor's pass, the room number, permission to do what she knew how to do. So on a Tuesday afternoon, Lori stood in the doorway of Emily Ashmor's hospital room and felt her breath catch. The machinery was relentless. Ventilators breathing for her, monitors tracking the rhythm of a heart that beat without will, IV lines dispensing nutrients into a body that couldn't hunger. Emily lay in the center of it all, smaller than Lori expected, her face smooth and peaceful in a way that suggested she was dreaming rather than lost. Lori pulled a chair close and sat. "Your boys are waiting for you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if Emily could hear. Some part of Lori believed that consciousness existed in ways science hadn't yet mapped, that somewhere beneath the coma, something in Emily was still listening. Then Lori began to hum. It was the same lullaby, the one her grandmother had taught her, the one that had called Noah and Liam and Ethan back to life. As the melody filled the room, something extraordinary happened. Emily's monitor changed rhythm. The steady beep shifted, becoming more complex. And then, Lori saw it clearly, Emily's fingers twitched. Not a reflex, not an involuntary muscle spasm, but a response, a recognition. Lori stopped humming and watched as Emily's fingers stilled. Then she began again, and again the fingers moved. The monitor adjusted. The rhythm changed. Lori understood then. The boys remembered this song from before they were born. From inside their mother, they'd heard this melody, felt its vibrations through amniotic fluid and bone. And Emily, somewhere, somehow, remembered teaching it to them. The song was a bridge between worlds. That night, Lori recorded it on her phone with the cheapest microphone she could find. Her voice wasn't polished, wasn't trained for recording, but it carried the weight of intention. She played it for the triplets the next morning, and they hummed back. Not perfectly, not in sync, but they hummed. Three small voices creating harmony with something they'd known before words, before consciousness, before the trauma that had stolen their mobility. Each day, their coordination improved. Each day they moved closer to the sound, following it like sailors following a star. Keith watched from the doorway, something shifting in his face. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, Lori sat with Keith in the study, the room where he'd fired her, the room that still carried the cold architecture of his grief. "I need to tell you something," Lori said quietly. Keith looked up from his work. "5 years ago, I had a daughter," Lori began, and the words came like a confession, like a door opening to a room she'd kept sealed. "Her name was Iris. She was 4 months old." Keith's expression changed. There was a complication, a breathing issue, and she needed a ventilator. It was one of the best hospitals in Atlanta. They assured me she'd be fine. Lori didn't cry, though tears existed somewhere in her chest, waiting. "The ventilator failed," she said simply. "A faulty sensor, equipment malfunction, manufacturer error. They said there was nothing anyone could have done." She watched Keith's face go pale, watched him understand what she was about to say. "The ventilator was made by Ashmor Medical." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Keith made a sound, something between a gasp and a sopa, and buried his face in his hands. "Lori, God, I didn't know." "There was a settlement," she continued, her voice steady. "A non-disclosure agreement. I couldn't even speak her name in connection with your company. I lost my daughter, and I lost the right to grieve her publicly. That's what I lost." Keith looked shattered, the kind of broken that money couldn't fix, that apologies couldn't mend. "I wanted to hate you," Lori said, and her voice was gentle now, carrying something that felt like forgiveness. "For so long, I wanted your suffering to match mine. But then I met your boys, and I understood that you were suffering, that you'd been suffering all along." Keith reached for her hand. She let him. "Maybe," Lori said softly, "you were meant to build something else this time. Something human. Not machines that replace what's broken, but things that heal what's broken." Keith held her hand like it was the last tangible thing in his world. And in that moment, something shifted in the mansion. The machinery seemed quieter. The silence seemed less like absence and more like space. Space where forgiveness could live, where redemption could begin, where a man and a woman could sit together in the wreckage of their separate griefs and find something like grace. Marjorie Ashmore had been staying in the guest house for 5 days when she discovered everything. She'd come unannounced, concerned, she said, about Keith's mental state and the questionable people he'd allowed into his home. What she'd meant was Lori. Marjorie had seen how Keith looked at her, had heard the softness in his voice when he spoke her name, and had decided this was weakness that needed correction. She found the hospital records first, Emily's file left open on Keith's desk, then the settlement documents, the non-disclosure agreement with Ashmore Medical's seal, and finally a photograph of a baby girl that Keith had apparently printed and kept in an envelope marked Iris. By the time Keith came home from the hospital that evening, Marjorie was waiting in his study, and she was furious. "Your cleaner is manipulating you," she said without preamble. Keith set down his briefcase slowly. "Marjorie, she told you about her daughter, didn't she? Made you feel guilty, made you think you owed her something. It's not like that. She's weaponizing her grief." Marjorie's voice was sharp, clinical. "Using your company's failure as leverage to get close to your sons. She's a danger, Keith. A danger. And you're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. Something shifted in Keith's face. Something that had nothing to do with confusion and everything to do with certainty. No, he said quietly. No what? Lori is not a danger, Keith said, and his voice carried an authority Marjorie hadn't heard from him in years. She's the only thing that matters in this house. She's given my sons back their lives, and she's asking for nothing in return except to keep loving them. You can't possibly. I can, Keith interrupted, and I am. My wife loves someone enough to record memories, to build connections my money couldn't touch. I'm not going to punish that. I'm not going to protect my pride by destroying the one person who actually sees my sons. He was defending her not as an employee or even as a caregiver, but as love. The next morning, while Keith was at the hospital, Marjorie made her move. She found Lori in the playroom with the boys, all three of them crawling now, coordinated and purposeful, moving across the carpet in ways that shouldn't have been possible 6 weeks ago. Lori was clapping softly, her voice encouraging them forward. Pack your things, Marjorie said coldly. You're finished here. Lori stood slowly. That's not your decision to make. My brother is grieving and unstable, Marjorie replied. As family, I'm taking protective measures. You need to leave. But when Lori moved toward the door, the triplets reacted. Noah reached out and grabbed her leg, his small hand gripping with intensity. Liam crawled toward her frantically. Ethan made a sound, not quite a word, but a desperate, aching cry that pierced the room. They weren't just moving, they were clinging, communicating a bond that went beyond words or professional responsibility. They were showing everyone in the room exactly who belonged to them. Lori knelt down, holding all three of them against her, and began to cry. That's when Keith arrived. He saw his sister, his three sons in tears, and Lori on the floor holding them like she might never let go. Something ancient and protective erupted from somewhere deep in his chest. Get out, he said to Marjorie. Keith, I'm trying to help. Get out, he repeated, his voice a weapon. Of my house, away from my family, and don't come back until you understand what love looks like. Marjorie left without another word. Keith knelt beside Lori and the boys, gathering all three children against him, and held them while they cried themselves toward calm. You're not going anywhere, he whispered to Lori, not as an employer, but as someone making a vow. You're family now, not staff, not help, family. Later that night, while sorting through Emily's things to give to Lori, clothes, photographs, memories of the woman they'd both loved in different ways, Keith found a letter. It was in Emily's handwriting, tucked in her jewelry box, dated the day before she went into the hospital. Keith, it read, Amanyam, if something happens to me, please promise me something. Promise you'll let love raise them, not schedules or money or your need to control everything. Let them feel, let them grieve. Let them be loved by whoever has the capacity to do it. I trust you to find that person. I love you, Emily. Keith read it 3 times, hands shaking. Then he walked to the playroom where Lori was talking the boys into their beds, and he showed her the letter. She read it silently, tears pooling in her eyes. She knew, Lori whispered. Somehow she knew. Keith took her hand. She's been guiding us this whole time, both of us. And in that moment, in a house that had once been a tomb, the mansion finally began to feel like a home. Keith froze in the doorway, his briefcase slipping from his hand. 3 small figures in matching green onesies were toddling across the floor. His sons, the boys who hadn't taken a single step since birth. Noah wobbled forward with determination. Liam followed with concentration etched into his tiny face, and Ethan brought up the rear, his laughter bubbling up like a spring finally breaking through stone. And at the center of it all, on her knees with tears in her eyes, was Lori Woolridge, her hands outstretched, her voice singing encouragement. Come on, babies, she whispered, clapping softly to guide them. You're so brave. Come to Mama. Keith's heart stopped. For a moment, he stood frozen, watching these 3 sons he'd believed were lost, moving toward a woman who'd given them back to themselves. And then something broke open inside him. Something that had been locked down since the day Emily slipped into the coma. Something that had convinced him love could be managed, measured, purchased. He dropped everything and sank onto the carpet. The boys immediately changed course. abandoning Lori to crawl toward him with the same determination they'd shown her. Keith gathered them against his chest, laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in years. The sound felt foreign in his mouth, raw and unpolished, and he didn't care. Lori wrapped her arms around all four of them, three little boys and one billionaire who'd finally learned that the most valuable currency in the world couldn't be minted. That evening, after the boys were tucked into their beds, Keith drove Lori to the hospital. It was the first time she'd been back since that initial afternoon, since she'd felt Emily's fingers twitch in response to the lullaby. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent lights, a place designed to save lives and preserve them in suspension. In Emily's room, nothing had changed. The machines still breathed for her. The monitors still tracked her heart's rhythm. But there was something different in Keith's approach now. He pulled a chair close for Lori instead of sitting separately, as if they were no longer visitors to Emily's bedside, but guardians of it. Lori began to hum, the same lullaby, the melody that had become the thread connecting all of them. As her voice filled the room, something extraordinary happened. Emily's eyes fluttered. Not the mechanical reflex Keith had seen 100 times before, but something intentional. Eyelids moving in rhythm with the song. And then, slowly a single tear slid down Emily's cheek. A tear, a sign of consciousness, of feeling, of someone who was somehow impossibly listening. Keith placed his hand over Lori's, their fingers intertwining over Emily's bedside. "You've given me back my sons," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion he thought he'd exhausted. "You've taught them to feel, to move, to live, and maybe—" He paused, watching Emily's face, watching that tear glisten in the hospital light. "Maybe you've given me back my wife, too." Lori squeezed his hand, and together they sat in the presence of something that felt like grace. The next morning, sunlight poured through the living room windows like liquid gold. The triplets were exploring their newfound mobility with the joy of explorers discovering uncharted territory. They crawled around Lori's knees, holding onto her legs for balance, their tiny hands gripping the fabric of her dress as they attempted to stand. She clapped her hands in rhythm, creating a dance between movement and sound, between what they'd been and what they were becoming. Keith watched from the doorway, but not as an observer this time, as a participant in the miracle. The mansion that had once been a tomb now breathed with life. The machines were still there in other rooms, still serving their purpose, but they no longer defined the space. Instead, the definition came from laughter. Children's laughter, genuine and unguarded. Noah took a brave step without holding on to Lori, wobbled, and caught himself against her leg, giggling at his own accomplishment. Liam hummed along with the melody, his tiny voice finding notes that shouldn't have existed in a boy who'd never spoken. Ethan reached up and patted Lori's cheek the way he did now, a gesture of the connection and trust that transcended biology. And Lori, this woman who'd lost so much, who'd been invisible in other people's homes, who'd believed that life had taken everything from her, knelt among three boys and loved them with a fierceness that redefined the word. As the triplets walked hand in hand around her knees, their steps growing stronger, their joy growing louder, the sunlight caught the scene like a photograph of what miracles actually look like. Not the dramatic kind found in medical textbooks, but the quiet kind, the kind that arrived in green cleaning gloves and soulful humming, the kind that proved love was the only technology that never failed. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.